And it's catching the light as well. Rooney.
Do you think she was sad not to make more films?
I think Grace was sad not to have an active creative life. She had a creative life in the sense of she was creative about everything she did, and she had a lot to do with other people being able to create. But I think she missed being, first of all, I think Grace missed being a working person. I mean, it's a funny thing to say, and I think it's a thing that husbands in a certain socioeconomic level, and certainly Rainier, didn't understand. I mean, Grace was so thrilled when she did her pressed flower showing in Paris at the gallery, and that there were little red dots that people bought them. I mean, she gave the money to charity, but the idea that somebody bought something she did meant a lot to her, because that was her idiom from being an American working girl from a family that in which people worked. Granted, they made a lot of money and were very successful at what they did, but I don't think that idiom translated too well on the continent. And people said she should never have sold them. How dare she? I mean, it's so tacky for her to... And then she said, now I have to make a big announcement about what charity I'm giving them to. Well, you give to charity and you don't talk about it. So that made her angry. So I think she looked for little ways as the children got older to be able to express herself creatively as an artist in some form that would be acceptable. I felt very much, my guess is that if Grace had not died at such an early age, that she would have done a few things. I think she would have gotten a place in New York, not because she was moving to New York, but so that she could have a little base there. She was starting the Foundation for Young Artists. I think she would have produced either in film or the theater, and I think she would have directed. My guess is she was heading herself toward directing. As we know, in acting, she really didn't, except for she did, the first thing she did was, obviously she did the poetry readings. But even that, people had tacky things to say about it. I don't mean about the quality of her work. It was like, there was a certain ilk of people to whom, oh, well, it was fine if she did it with Prince Philip at the Albert Hall for some great British charity. Or if she did it in the United States at some grand place for some noble cause. But if she did it in a sort of smallish town for the local university or college, and it wasn't, glitzy enough, they said, well, what is she doing in all these tacky little places? Well, in fact, she was not only doing what she loved, which was doing the poetry readings, but what she adored fabulously much was afterwards, in all the hotel rooms, that like actors on the road, like from the old days of touring theater. Everybody sitting around in somebody's living room, having pizzas sent in and sitting on the floor with bare feet, telling old stories and theater stories and jokes and laughing. And it was very much her own spirit and self involved in that. And I think it's unfathomably sad that she never got to the point in her life where she figured it was okay to do it. And she was just getting to.
Before one of our breaks, you were just beginning to tell me a bit about her spending so much time in Paris and less time in Monaco. Why was that?
Well, because I think the girls, the children as they grew up, needed broader influences than I think were available locally. Which isn't to say that they didn't love, and that Grace didn't love Monaco. She came to adore it very much as her own. And then they had the farm. They had Rockagel as well, which was, their sort of retreat that they went to often. But I think Grace felt the girls needed expanded educational opportunities, expanded cultural opportunities on a broader sense. Then they needed to be in a place where they were not, Altesse. I mean, not that they weren't their highnesses in Paris, because they were wherever they went, but I mean where it was not all as locally contained. So they wanted to go, and Grace would not let them go alone. So she went, and then, Albert liked to be at Princess Charlotte's chateau outside of Paris. Rainier liked to be there, rather, and Grace was fine. By then she and her mother-in-law were getting along fine, but it just wasn't I mean, she wasn't that much, she didn't like hunting, she didn't, you know. So there were some differences of interest at that point. And Rainier was very, very absorbed in the expansion of Monaco in terms of building small industry and opening Fonvier and reclaiming the land from the sea, and all of which is quite remarkable and has really given an economic base to the Monegasque citizenry. While Grace did a great many things there about arts and culture and medical facilities and all sorts of things. But I think she just felt the girls wanted to go, and she would never have thought to let them go. Not together, but it happened at different ages. I just think she would not have done that, you know, let them go without her being there. Because again, this terrible stuff that happened to them all the time with the press assault and how that affected them and whatever. It was deeply affecting, and I don't think any of us can fathom the effect that that had on Stephanie after Grace's death. Because imagine, I mean, she was 17. She was very close to her mom. I have the same thing. I have 3 daughters. I have 3 stepsons as well, but I have 3 daughters. And my 2 oldest children are like Grace's 2 oldest, you know, within 2 years of each other. And they're all contemporary. And then Stephanie, Princess Stephanie, and my daughter Nina, my Amy and Victoria, my children are Albert and Carolyn's contemporaries. Then we had this space, and then came the younger one, and that had an effect, an odd effect, because in Grace's case, she had the miscarriage after that, and then knew she could not have any more children. In my case, I just decided not to. But still, I think we both found it much harder to let go of the youngest one, because when you define yourself as a mom for a long time, it's hard to let go of the baby. You know, you sort of champion the others. Ah, good, darling. You know, spread your wings, fly a little. Yes, encourage you. Isn't this wonderful? And then your baby, it's like, oh my God, I'm not going to have any more babies, you know. So that makes, at that age, a kind of enmeshment, I think, between mother and child, especially if it's a daughter, that is both wonderful in many ways and sometimes difficult. But Stephanie was still very enmeshed with her mom at that age. And to lose her at all, to lose her that way, to be in the car with her when it happened, to come to in a hospital with your neck in a brace to find out that your mother's dead, and to get out of the hospital and for the rest of your life, it appears, have to read that you killed her somehow. You were driving, which she wasn't. You were having an argument with her, and that's why she had a stroke. I mean, what a horrible, horrible thing for some. Now, I mean, she knows it's the press, and yes, there is all that sophistication, but again, it's somebody else defining something that's so horrible for you to try to adjust to anyway at that age. I don't think anybody's ever understood that, you know. So I think it's hard for all of them to define their roles, particularly the girls. Remember, you're raised with the burden, as I said before, all the privilege, all the perks, all the wonderful stuff that everybody there is grateful for having been afforded in their lifetime. But you're raised with the burden of being the princely family, and the restrictions and the criticism and the public focus and the negative definitions of yourself that brings. In Carolyn and Stephanie's case, they're not ever going to be running Monaco. So you get all of that, and then, but what's my life about? You know, what's my job? Now, I mean, the children have been very important to all of them. The grandchildren, to Rainier and to the girls, and God knows to Stefano before he died. Carolyn, I think, has tried to make a life for herself, you know, by moving away and going to the, you know, her farm and trying to sort of come in for what she needs to do professionally, in a sense, and then go back and have this other life. I think it's been harder for Stephanie to define herself.
Were you shocked by the death?
Oh my God. You know, I've never seen such an incredible spectrum of people shocked by something that happened as that. First of all, there was that early announcement that the accident had happened, that Grace had a broken rib and a broken, I think, femur, if that's the bone in the thigh, and a mild concussion, and would be fine. So, I mean, I sent a telegram immediately. I was en route from somewhere else in the States to New York City on business. And I had already, and I sent a telegram, and then my then husband said to me, well, look, if she's going to not be able to come to the States and do her poetry reading in the fall, that would be a great time for you to just knock off work, Judy, and go over and hang out with her for a while, which you keep saying you want to do somewhere, both of you, so do it. That's a perfect time. And then, I mean, the next day in New York, I walked out of my office and, no, actually my daughter called and asked to speak with my husband to tell him to tell me. And, I mean, I was reeling. The first thing I thought of is she never lived to see her grandchildren. And that was just the first thing that hit me, when anything conscious hit me at all. But, you know, because they again had not communicated in between the first evaluation of what had happened and what the impact of what was on her, and not having the CAT scan at the hospital and having to take her out, and then understanding that there was no brain activity and there was never going to be any brain activity. And then the family not wanting to feel that they had to, you know, I mean, at what moment are they supposed to say, oh, well, here, I'll go talk to the press about everything? I mean, they were all, and Nadia Lacoste, who was the very close friend and very capable liaison for the palace and the government of Monaco with the press, was away on holiday in Germany and was traveling and couldn't be reached by phone till she reached the next little inn that she and her husband were staying at. So there really wasn't anybody there managing all of that. And then having to make the decision about whether to keep the machines on or pull the plug, and what would Grace have wanted. I mean, you know, I'm sorry they didn't have time to walk out the, you know, we see now everybody's got a press representatives outside hospital doors giving you reports of everybody's surgery and everything. So it was so shocking. I think the other thing that was shocking about it was that you want somebody that good to last. They never last long enough, but you want them to last longer than that. You want them to be there past 53. I remember in New York, taxi drivers were crying. I'd get in a taxi. They didn't know I knew Grace. I mean, they'd have the paper and it was all over it. And tears. And I'd say, "What? Are you okay?" You know, "Oh, I'm just thinking about Princess Grace." You know, I mean, everybody. Because there was a sense that what you saw was what she was. A really decent, fine human being. Not perfect. Harder on herself for not being perfect than she was on all the rest of us. But I think we thought she'd be there as a sort of icon of a lot of things we hoped humanity was about for a very long time. And it was shocking to lose her for all of us, I think. And then on a personal basis, terrible.
This really is the last question. In fact, it's a repeat because of that stupid noise. I'm afraid it's back to this thing of the reports of, one hears that Grace, because she was so attractive and that she had this exciting Hollywood life, that she had affairs with most of her leading men.
You know, first of all, you have to understand that it's very true that when actors and actresses work together, and especially in very romantic, kind of, this is a very romantic era, the 50s. But it was also an era in which we stayed in the period of longing for a long time without necessarily culminating. I mean, that's hard to understand today when you think of people going out and perhaps going to bed with one another the first night and then never even seeing each other again. I mean, this was like, I beg your pardon, I mean, that didn't happen. So, yes, I'm sure there were some romantic feelings between Grace and some of her leading men, and you know, in some cases they talk about it with Bing Crosby. I mean, people, well, I happen to know, I mean, in that case, Bing Crosby was gaga about Grace. I mean, even his now widow, Catherine, when they visited Grace and Rainier in Monaco, Catherine said, "My husband says he's never been in love with anybody. I mean, it's the biggest love of his whole life, you. And she said, now that I've met you, I understand. But in fact, Grace was not attracted to Bing Crosby. And it was always sort of a thing of, I mean, they weren't married at the time, Catherine and Bing, but I mean, it was always sort of a thing of Grace ducking him. I don't mean that. She adored him and she was friendly with him and loved working with him, but it was not a romance. And she had no interest in that. But I mean, they kept doing that and just linking her with everybody. And the longer she lived, and now after her death, they keep creating more people she supposedly had affairs with. I don't know who ever slept with anybody. I mean, I've never seen anybody's sex life but my own. So how can I give testimony to who did or who didn't? It's entirely possible that there were sort of romantic, longing things going on without an actual affair and without connotes in today's world. I don't know who was a virgin and who wasn't. I mean, there's mythology that we were all virginal then. We weren't all. I mean, can't speak for Grace. I certainly can't. For myself, I know I wasn't, and most of my friends weren't. But that didn't mean that we were promiscuous. And, all I know is we fell in love. But I don't know what anybody did about that specifically. But Grace was 26 when she married Rainier, and I don't think, I don't know what they talked about together about that, but I don't, I mean, there's some terrible story in some book about him having some gynecologist, inspect her on the examining table to see, I mean, please, I mean, it sounds like the Middle Ages. It never happened, number one, and I'm sure Rainier would never have asked for it to happen, number two, and I'm sure it wasn't an issue. I mean, everybody had another life. She wasn't a baby, and I don't know, but she was certainly magical. So, I mean, everybody fell in love with her, but that had nothing to do most often with sexual things. So I don't know, and I think people who purport to tell you exactly who slept with whom, particularly from that era, are all making it up as they go. Because nobody talked about it in those days. Even confiding in girlfriends confiding, even single girls who weren't famous and didn't whatever and were of an age where it would have been fine. If they talked about relationships in terms of the feeling and the quality of the relationship, and they didn't come home and say, oh, well, I just went to bed with so-and-so. I mean, and not on the basis of trying to be sneaky. It just was like, that's your private life, and that's your private life, and whatever. But it certainly was not promiscuity, as it's sometimes very nastily been made out to be.
Well done. Cut.
Rooney.
Was Grace always religious?
Yes, Grace was always religious, and Grace was specifically religious in the Catholic religion. The most fascinating thing about Grace's inner self, though, was, I think, not only her Catholicism, but more than that, her spirituality. She had a deep sense of spirit, connection to the universe, connection to people, animals, nature, flowers. A deep sense of an order in the universe with which she somehow wanted to be in harmony. We had lots of conversations about differences of ways of looking at things because I'm Jewish and she was Catholic. Her friends were, Grace never chose friends because of anything about their religion or social status or ethnic anything. I mean, she just wasn't into all of that. Sometimes I think, which is interesting, sometimes Grace's spirituality was in conflict with her Catholicism, if you know what I mean, because sometimes within Catholicism there's a more narrowly defined set of definitions than perhaps one comes to as one grows spiritually. But I think she made a considerable amount of peace with that. And I think that's why when Grace spoke about things about religion, she never seemed to be critical in a kind of way that sometimes people in her position can be. So yes, she was very much a part of her church. It mattered greatly to her, deeply. Never as a pose or as because she was in Monaco and was the prince. I mean, she was, and interestingly enough, the only break with that I know is that Princess Caroline told me that when she and her first husband were very unhappy and she wanted to be out of the marriage, or she would, knew the marriage was really a failure and could not work at all. Strangely enough, and I didn't know this until long after Grace had died, it was Grace who encouraged her to get a divorce. It was Caroline who said, "I can't, Mommy." I mean, and her Catholic background, her sense of whatever it was, she thought she couldn't. And Grace said, "You have to. You have to get a divorce. You have a good, wonderful life ahead of you, and you've made a mistake, and God would not want you to spend the rest of your life not being able to have second chances for yourself in something so important as who you live your life with and love and who you have children with." And that was unexpected because of Grace's Catholicism, but again, that's Grace's spirituality.
Did Grace look for answers to her life?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, Grace was, when I say look for answers, I think Grace looked for answers to her life, but I think she looked more for questions, to be sure she didn't miss those. It's just very easy to become complacent and get an answer at a given point, and then think, oh, well, I've answered that, next, or, and I'll just coast from here. I think Grace was very aware that life, however long anybody lives, is a process of growth and development and questions and answers. And that's why we had that running joke, which we said right up to the end of her life, which is, what are we going to be when we grow up? We used to keep saying, okay, now what are we going to be when we grow up? Because we were aware that there was more growing and there were more questions and more answers. And as I said about Grace not having an opportunity to do more work creatively, where she was the artist again in some way, not just helping others to do that. I think she was on that verge of knowing that there was a whole new set of questions out there for her. And I think that's natural when your children get to a certain age, and no matter how devoted to them you are, you just can't be with them that much because they're off doing their own thing, I think that time for Grace and for a new whole segment of her life and a new self-definition and a new sense of her contact with her inner self and her universe was just coming to her, which is why it's just endlessly sad to think about the fact that she never got to
How do you mean it was just coming to her?
Well, I think she had come to a place where she understood that she couldn't please everybody all the time. And that she would never have been a selfish person, but I think she was coming to that age where you begin to say, well, what about the rest of my life now? I mean, she would have had the grandchildren, and that would have been a big part of her life, as it is with all of ours. But it's a time for women. I think in our parents' generation, maybe I have to go back to do this. In our parents' generation, women got to that age, and they just sort of slipped off to the side and hovered there for a while. If they didn't, and they had some sense of great direction, everybody thought they were being weird because they had gone through change of life or something, In our generation, I think we got to that age and we said, well, look, we're not so old, my God, I've got a whole life ahead of me. What do I want to do with it? And I don't want to think anymore in terms of, in 10 years I'll do that, or when the kids have grown, or whatever, because I'm in my 50s now or whatever, and I don't want to think in 10-year terms, and my kids are grown and they're not sitting here and I can't talk to them all day or live their lives in my head 24 hours a day to be sure they're safe and well, and there's only so much I can protect them from anyway. I have to hope I did enough before this. And so then you say, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I think Grace was at that point where she realized that really was something she had the power to make some decisions about. And I think that as she did more for herself, I have this sense that somehow yet another wonderful dimension would have happened for her and Rainier together, because it would have been sort of letting go of that whole chunk of your life where you're very focused on your kids and building your enterprise and whatever. And now it's like, hey, if you're lucky enough to be healthy, if you're lucky enough, and certainly they were, to have, ways to go with access and assets and whatever you want to do. Not that she would have bought her way into anything, I don't mean that. It's a great treat time. And she didn't have the treat.
Do you think she was worried about getting old or losing her looks?
Well, she worried about her weight. That's primarily what she worried about, because she really loved to eat. It was so funny because she was so skinny when she was younger. I mean, look at her at the wedding, because she lost so much weight with all that going on. But she was always very reed slim, And she loved to eat, and she loved caviar, which is, of course, like, not exactly the most becoming thing in the world in terms of her waistline. And so that concerned her, that she looked frumpy. Well, we said, that's fine, put on your sensible shoes again, you'll be right in character. But so she wanted to take the weight off, and she was starting to do that. But she had a very, it's strange for all of us, none of us can forget that for about 8 months before she died, Grace had complained of a cold she couldn't shake that had headaches with it. And we all have to wonder if there was not some forewarning of the strokes. Had she gone to somebody and said, is something else going on besides what I'm presuming I have, which is a lousy cold and bad sinus trouble? And she didn't like the way she looked then, because it was making her feel puffy in the face. But I mean, Grace knew she was beautiful. Didn't matter so much to her, all that. I can't say she didn't have an ego and didn't want to look good. But I don't think she had any illusions at her age that she would go back and become, a leading lady in romantic movies. First of all, they weren't even making them anymore. But I don't think that's where she saw herself going, so I don't think the question of exactly how young she looked distressed her. Although I'm sure there was some part of her that must have, seen herself aging and been less than thrilled at some point with that. How much, I don't know. I don't think it drove her in any way,
So much speculation about how she died and whether it was a stroke. Do you think it was a stroke?
Oh, I know it was. Yeah. No, I don't think there's any question. I interviewed for my, first of all, I, talked to so many people over the years, but then when I did my book, I went around and interviewed all sorts of people, including the fellow in the truck behind her. I don't know if you've ever driven those roads. I've driven them a lot coming up and down from Rocagel to Monaco. They are just wildly circuitous, dangerous, hairpin turns, some of them. You really have to, even if you think you drive in the canyons, twisting and turning here, it's not like that. And she appeared to be braking for that turn. And he says Stephanie was sitting in the passenger seat and Grace was driving, the fellow behind them. So, not that he knew exactly, he didn't know who it was at that point, but in describing what he saw in the window, who was in which seat, it seems imminently clear. And I know Grace, too. She was a stickler for that kind of stuff. She would never have let Stephanie drive without her license. Also, you have to know that the one thing Grace did not do well in her life was drive. It was a running joke throughout her whole life. That's what's so, ironic or terrible about the way she died, is because we always used to kid her about what a lousy driver she was. But anyway, she started to brake for the turn. He said he saw the lights, the brake lights go on. And the car was slowing. And then all of a sudden it was like it was just out of control and hurtling ahead and no lights and no anything. What I understand from the doctors I've spoken with is that the first stroke, the one she had while driving still on the road, had she had it in, at home or in an office or a restaurant or someplace, she probably would have blacked out, fallen down, and the worst thing that would have probably happened to her is if she hit her head on something as she was falling. There would have been probably some minor rehab work to do, possibly even finished by the time she got out of the hospital. But when the impact came with the crash, there was not only the impact and the brain damage, but she had a second stroke that was massive. So that's, I don't think there's any question that that's what happened. I mean, what do you think happened? The mafia killed her? I mean...
Well, there's all these stories.
Well, that's my point. There's always stories. I mean, she died the way she died. It's not a mystery. It's terribly sad. It's a fluke that it happened in the car. As I said, if it happened anywhere else, it wouldn't have had that kind of impact unless, but then even if she'd hit her head on a table falling down, it wouldn't have been what a car crash is when you floated in the air and then dropped. And I mean, to say, well, Stephanie could have saved her. I mean, she did grab the handbrake, but what do you do when you grab a handbrake mid-air? First of all, can you pull it up? Secondly, what do you think it makes the car do? Back up and hit the road again? I mean, what does it mean to you when you're flying off a cliff at that point? So, I mean, that's why it's so unfair to say, oh, well, Stephanie could have saved her. She could have gotten the handbrake up. By the time you realize the fellow behind her said it was so fast, there's no way. You don't even know what's happening. So, I mean, I don't have any doubt that she died the way I've just said.
Picture like it's a commercial.
It's rolling, Mickey.
Yeah, well, we're back to. Gosh, I'm so thrilled that I may be coming to London and playing the Palladium again, where I played it, 40 years ago. Maybe 45 years ago, when Val Parnell was the head of the Palladium. And of course, I'm so very proud to be part of the British Isles because my father was born in Glasgow, Scotland. So I'm a Glasskite. And
Keep sitting back.
and I'm very, 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 very honored. I was there when Mrs. Thatcher was still in the House of
So
Representatives.
tell me something back to Grace. Which are the films that you think she was best in? Which films did you like of hers?
I like them all. I mean, I've made over 300 motion pictures myself, just me. And I've been in a lot of good ones. And I've been in a lot of pictures that were so bad, they weren't released, they escaped. But I really can't find a performance or a motion picture that Grace Kelly had made in my mind's eye. And thinking back in her altogether too short career as an actress. It was bad. And that's a wonderful thing to remember.
Tell me, have you any nice anecdotes about Grace or you or William Holden or all of you on Topiary?
No, I wish I could give you. I would have I've written 7 novels, and I would have written a book of anecdotes of things that had happened to me. But it's a funny thing about motion picture people. Once the day's end of the shooting is over, everybody just goes their own ways. And there really aren't, there is no camaraderie while you're on a picture, at least. And for that matter, even today. I mean, I've made 2 pictures with Bob Hope, and I don't see Bob Hope. I haven't seen Bob for 8 years. And speaking of Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window with Grace, I understand, and I've heard through the grapevine, that they're going to redo the picture Rear Window. Have you heard anything about that?
No.
Well, they are. They're going to redo the Rear Window. Yeah, and that was But my favorite, I shouldn't say this, but I had a favorite. And I loved Cary Grant. He was one of my very, very best friends. I adored Robert Cummings. Thought he was a fine actor and much better than the pictures that were afforded him. Milan, who had come from Republic Pictures at the time, starting out there, as did Duke Wayne, John Wayne. You know, that now that I think about it, it would have been a strange thing to have Grace Kelly play and do a picture with John Wayne.
Why'd you say that?
Because I just said it.
But why?
Because it's my opinion. You're trying to get into a situation, evidently, of giving me the opportunity of telling you what good would it be for the picture. Well, I think that the two people are so different. You've got this Americana legend, and you've got the princess. I would have written and called the picture The Princess and the Cowboy.
How do you like to remember Grace?
I remember Grace Kelly very easily by remembering when we were doing Bridges of Tokery of how nice, genuinely nice and lovely she was to everyone on the set and all of the performers. Whether or not it was Charles McGraw or it was Frederick March or Bill Holden or myself. And when someone is nice, it's very tough to be differently. And Grace Kelly will always be a brilliantly nice princess. You know, princesses can be a little rough. But she was a princess that had class. She was born to be a princess. I feel very badly about the car accident in Monaco. And I often think of Grace Kelly as a woman I would like to have seen continue on and 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 on. But she will always be with us through the wonderful motion pictures that she had made and that the good Lord had given her the opportunity to work with some of the great people that are in our motion pictures over here. Even though Dial M for Murder was set with an English background, they made it all here on the stage at Universal or something, wherever Hitchcock was making it at that time. But it's a strange thing. Hitchcock adored Grace Kelly. Didn't like actors and actresses, but once he liked someone, you knew darn well that you were well liked. And she knew that Hitch, as we used to call him, absolutely loved and adored her. You know, I want to thank you very much for allowing me to expand and expound and think back on some memories of one of the most beautiful women that the world has ever known. A woman that wore her crown and her royalty with solemnity, and the beauty of a real princess, queen.
We hear a lot about her sense of.
But you know, it's just wonderful. Have you anything else you want?
Yes, I'd like to ask, we hear a lot about her sense of humour and that she enjoyed practical jokes. Was there any of that on the set of Topiary?
Well, being a much younger man at the time, I wasn't going to get out of line and start playing any practical jokes with the leading lady of William Holden. But I'm certain that she had a great feeling for a lot of humor. She never lost her good taste, and she never lost being a real human being. Though she was from Philadelphia, she was really from royalty. Grace Kelly, one of the most beautiful and gracious of anybody that's ever adorned the silver screen. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk about her. I'll always love her, and I'm sure the publics of the world will go along with me on that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. When did you first get to know Grace Kelly?
Well, I first met Grace in 1953. Our lives seemed to be.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Wait. I changed the chair, but I didn't change the microphone.
Oh, hello.
But good. Sorry for that.
No problem.
Still rolling.
Okay.
I'll ask you.
Okay.
So, when did you first meet Grace Kelly?
Well, I first met Grace in April of 1953. Strangely enough, from then on, our lives seemed to be bound up with weddings of one kind or another, our own, other people's, our children's eventually. But I met her at my first wedding at the Plaza Hotel in New York. She had just finished shooting Mogambo in Africa with Clark Gable and Ava Gardner, and they'd finished her last shot so that she could fly to New York through London and be at my wedding to Jay Cantor, who was then her agent and very close friend. So I met her going through the receiving line at my wedding.
And you became friends?
We did, not immediately. I mean, we were put together immediately because of her relationship with Jay, not only her professional relationship, but her personal relationship, because they were sort of like brother and sister. So we saw one another for a few months on those terms, but always in some context which she and Jay had arranged. And then, and I quite liked her, and I didn't feel that, I felt she quite liked me, but it was just that Jay was the link between us. And then one night we went to a screening, a sneak preview in Philadelphia of one of her films. I think it was Dial M, I may be wrong. And Dial M for Murder. But we were coming home on the milk train, as they used to call it, from Philadelphia to New York, which is a trip of a little over an hour. And it was very late, and somebody put us on the train with champagne and little snacks. There were a whole group of us, and everyone else fell asleep. Grace and I stayed awake. And we sat in those kinds of seats where you can pull one back and face one another. And we were talking. And she said something about wondering if people thought she was very aloof, or if I did. And she said, because I look at you and when you go into a room full of people or you're visiting, whatever, around, you seem so comfortable and so whatever. She said, but I'm very shy. And I'm also nearsighted, so I can't ever tell who it is that's approaching me. And I read about, sometimes in the paper, they would say things about her not recognizing people or being sort of distant. And she said, half the time it's because I don't know who I'm talking to, unless I put my glasses on. And she said, maybe you don't understand being shy. And I said, well, of course I do. It's just that we do it differently. I come into the room shy and put a lampshade on my head and dance on the tables. And you stay in the corner till... And it was a funny moment because it was so much sharing of some part of an inner life feeling, which people didn't do a lot of in those days. And from then, we talked about, I said I was so glad that she and Jay were close and that it was so nice when your husband has a friend whom you so truly enjoy. And she said, well, it's so nice when somebody you're close to marries somebody you also can love and whatever. And from that moment on, that was just it.
So you were almost a kind of confidant from that moment on.
Yes, I think Grace, Grace was very discreet. Goodness knows we all, I think, are aware of her sense of propriety as life went on and what she spoke of and didn't speak of. But she was extraordinarily intimate with her friends, especially for the time, really, when you think about it, and for somebody who had so much public recognition at all times. But she was very cautious to pick her spots. And when I wrote my book, The Bridesmaids, about all of us who attended her at the wedding and about Grace and Rainier and their family, it was a very difficult line to walk because I didn't want to write a Pollyanna and her Glad Girls, a book that was not true, but I certainly would never have betrayed anybody's confidences. So I sort of went from those things with other people who were still alive that they were comfortable with expressing in their own terms. It was difficult doing it with Grace because she was no longer there to speak for herself by the time I wrote the book. With Rainey and the children, they did, have something to say about what they were quoted as or what I spoke about with them, but mostly it was my sense of them. And of course, when you're writing about friends, your sense is never judgmental. But she was able to be very close to her friends in a very warm, wonderful way. And the giggliest person I know. I mean, she was just so full of wonderful laughter, Grace. So she was very, in many ways, religious, spiritual, serious about life. She was also irreverent and had a wonderful notion of the balance of things, in the part that, yes, it's all what it is and it matters, and what matters a lot. But she also, I think, recognized that it was never going to be perfect. I think perhaps her own sense of driving herself to perfection was not as compassionate toward herself as she was to the rest of us.
There seems to be quite a few contradictions in her life. Her family seemed to be quite strict, and then she was quite a dutiful daughter. On the other hand, she enjoyed the life of New York. Did she talk to you about her family?
She did speak to me about her family often. When we met, we were in our 20s, and I think people still felt very shaped or feel very shaped by their families in their 20s. Grace loved having a family that was a unit, and it was very much so the Kelly family. She was sometimes uncomfortable with her role in that unit. First of all, her father was very taken with sports and kind of all-American macho kind of life and out in the wilds and the open and, gung-ho. I mean, John Kelly was he was a brick builder, and he was a man's man. Grace, on the other hand, had a certain kind of sensibility that didn't really jibe too well with that. Even her mother, Ma Kelly, had been a coach of women's physical education at a college, women's college, early on. One of the first female PE coaches in America. And so Grace's older sister, Peggy, first of all, was the oldest, the firstborn, and secondly, was perfect for the Kellys because she just fit in with all of that. She was competitive and liked sports and was sort of, hail fellow, well met, and very pretty and very nice and feminine and all that. But she was the true. I remember Grace telling me that her father forever talked about the fact that when Peggy was, I don't know, 6 months old, you could sit her on your palm, the palm of your hand, and she would sit up straight and not fall over. Those were some great character accomplishment? I don't know. So they didn't quite know what to make of Gracie. And, then there was Grace's brother, and then Grace was the baby, and then before you know it, if she would have flowered in the role of the baby, perhaps, I don't know, but she wasn't the baby for long because then Lizzie came. So she was kind of a middle child. Kel, her brother, of course, is the one on whom John B., the father, pegged his hopes for retribution because he had been, they had not allowed him to row in the Henley Regatta because of his humble origins, the father, many years earlier. So he made his son into the oarsman that he wanted him to be because the world changed, and he had by then, the father had achieved a certain kind of success, and then Kel could row at Henley, the son, and he could, and he won. I mean, he won everything he did, but they couldn't quite, I don't think they could find a family purpose for Grace. She was not sickly, but she got colds a lot when she was a child. She had ear infections. We all had to play sports and be competitive at school in order, that was just required in those days. Grace did it and did it perfectly adequately, but not, with star quality. Or it didn't matter to her. Even the things that she did supremely well didn't matter to her a lot. And nobody could sort of understand this in the Kelly household. So she was extremely close to her Uncle George, the playwright, because he had that sort of artistic sensibility that appealed to her from a very young age. And the one sense that I had, independent of anything Grace said, of any tension in the family, or not, I don't mean overt tension, but a sense of her being sort of left aside in the process of the Kelly household, was that I believe it was the same sneak preview in Philadelphia where we became friends on the ride home on the train. The Kellys had a pre-preview little buffet dinner at their house or supper at their house before we went on to the theater. And I said to Mr. Kelly, whom I had only met once or twice before, I asked him if he wasn't tremendously proud of Grace. And I said, I know the circumstances under which she went off to New York and became a model and an actress and all of that. But isn't it remarkable what's happening with her career so quickly? And the kind of attention and respect she's gaining as an actress. And he said, well, I let her go to New York to become an actress because I didn't know what else she could do. And I sort of saw it all from that. Now, one of the things that I know Grace was very grateful about, and I think all of us who were close to her were grateful, is that, her dad died quite young. But fortunately, before he did, there was a real creation of a bond between Grace and her father that had not, I think, existed during childhood. I think not only, of course, they were somewhat dazzled and impressed with their daughter going off and doing this, and it was funny because she then became, the Kelly everybody talked about, and the family was sort of swept along in this momentum. But I think that settled down, and then it was just Grace and her husband and children, but it was about what Grace was doing with her life and the way she was leading it and what she was doing in Monaco and the kind of extraordinary woman she had become. I think her dad came to respect that enormously.
She seemed to have had quite a lot of confrontations with her father and mother over some of the men she went out with, for instance, Oleg Cassini. Did she talk to you about that at all?
Yes, well, it was an era in which a tremendous number of fathers had something not very kind to say about the men their daughter chose to go out with. There was still, maybe it's a carryover from the generation or two before theirs, when families picked who was appropriate for their children to marry. And, you know, there's part of that, nobody's ever good enough for my little girl. I mean, there's all of that in there. But in this case, first of all of the men Grace was attracted to, if you think about it, were sort of artistic, European. They were a whole other thing than the Kelly sports pro, all-American macho man. And which is not to say that they were effeminate. I'm just saying it was an entirely different sort of patina on all of them. Some of them were involved with arts or creating things as opposed to running businesses or the team or whatever. Because all the fellows that her family ever fixed her up with, she was very bored with, frankly. But then also, you know, the Kellys were Catholic. Oleg had been married before. Jean-Pierre Raymond had been married before. I mean, there were reasons why they weren't sort of hand-picked by the Kelly family. And Grace was, as many of us were in those days, just swept away by romance. I mean, you know, there was a lot of romantic mythology in this post-World War II. You know, the boys had come home, we'd been victorious, the country was prospering, and the time seemed easy. Of course, we know there was a lot of turmoil underneath that was going to have to be resolved eventually, but it seemed like an easy, happy time, and that's, of course, romance flourishes, but we were all quite gaga about falling in love. So when Grace fell in love, she was convinced that it was, you know, as we all were, well, now I should get engaged and get married. And none of the people that she fell in love with were really, you know, anybody the Kellys would have wanted on their list of son-in-laws.
She
So-
seems to have fallen in love and wanted to get married to quite a few people.
Yes, well, as I said in my book, I think that was, for those of us who were into it at all in those days, volume was a big thing. When I say that, we didn't date thousands of people, but we fell in love a lot. And I don't know whether we fell in love with love or we fell in love with falling in love. I mean, that early stage of that is just so compelling and wonderful and romantic. But there was all this mythology about that in our upbringing and in our culture and media at the time. Well, we didn't even call it media, but in the movies. And, you know, it was just all, oh, swept off your feet. Oh, you know, heavens, here I go. Isn't this bliss, and everything will be perfect forevermore. And yes, that was quite typical of Grace. She was very much a one-man woman, but not only, you know, exclusively to one person before she met Rainier. And I think that's true of all of us. But you forget, Grace didn't get married till she was 26, which was, you know, practically over the hill in those years. I mean, people got married at 18 and 19 and 17 and 20, and 20 was sort of, I was married at 20 the first time, and it was sort of marginal, you know.